Hello, everyone. Today we have Dr. Elliott Rouse, an associate professor of robotics and mechanical engineering at the University of Michigan, where he directs the Neurobionics Lab, studying how and why people use wearable robotic systems. His team's open, data-driven approach, including innovations like the open source leg we collaborate on, is redefining collaboration in prosthetics and exoskeleton research. A recipient of the NSF Career Award and the Henry Russell Award, he's also a senior research scientist at the Institute for Human and Machine Cognition and a former Google X researcher who helped launch their exoskeleton development team. Welcome, Elliott. Thrilled to have you today.
Thanks, Josh. I'm excited to be here. I've always been a fan of these podcasts, so it's fun to be on it.
Thank you so much. You have a truly unique background, ranging from auto racing to the Moonshot Factory, and of course, as a professor. Could you set the stage for our listeners with a little bit of a life story? How did you find yourself here today?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I had kind of a traditional path into rehabilitation research. Kind of that started when I was in college at full-time mechanical engineering, and then I worked full-time in auto racing. So I was a mechanic, meaning I helped work on the car, keep it running. I worked in the pit crew and kind of took apart the car and clean it, inspect it, put it back together. Pretty much the coolest possible job ever as an engineer. So I sort of felt like this is what I'll do for the rest of my life. Like I was really excited to be involved. I was maybe 21 and 22 at the time. Kind of eventually, what actually I saw was that it wasn't as fulfilling as I wanted, and that what I really wanted or what I longed for at that time was impact on people's lives. And so that kind of got me thinking about how could I do that? And why isn't that auto racing? And I decided like rehabilitation research and particularly like advanced engineering was kind of the direction I wanted to go. So I didn't know anything about advanced engineering or graduate research, but I kind of fell into a graduate study at Northwestern, still kind of not knowing what direction to go. I knew two things, and this is kind of partly the way I tell students to think about it now, but I knew two things at that time. I knew that I wanted to impact people's lives, maybe particularly people with disabilities. And I knew that I liked the topic of system dynamics, which was an engineering topic I'd seen in class. And that's it. So I decided to go in a direction, take a step like in that direction and figure it out from there. And that's what I did. So then I went to grad school and had a wonderful time there at Northwestern in Chicago, at Shirley Ryan AbilityLab there, the hospital, and did some really fantastic research. And then I, kind of had some other opportunities that came up. But I'd say like the thing that maybe kept that machine going was just that whatever I was doing at the time, I tried my hardest and I did what I thought was good work. I prioritized doing a good job. And then I would take that experience and see where it could take me next. And I just repeated that over and over and over again. Uh, so that's been kind of my path, and it's been starting as hands-on and mechanic. I actually still think of myself as a mechanic that just became a professor, but I still use all those hands-on tools actually, and those skills, and that's maybe a big part of my lab here is the hands-on side, and that we are able to do those things, and they're not, we're not intimidated by them. So the students now get that same training, which is pretty fun. That's a little bit about the path and kind of how I got into it. How's that sound?
It's great. And it reminds me of my own path. I mean, I never got into auto racing professionally, but cars, trains, planes, mountain bikes, these were the things that got me into engineering.
Totally.
But I faced a similar existential dilemma at some point. It strikes me that Shirley Ryan was probably a particularly serendipitous place to land. for you, given the kind of applied research they do there. Could you expand on that environment a little bit? Why that was so special?
I can. It is. It's quite a wonderful place. Then it was called the Rehabilitation Institute of Chicago, and now it's called Shirley Ryan AbilityLab. I was a PhD student at Northwestern that worked in a laboratory there called the Center for Bionic Medicine, and they've done a lot of different rehabilitation approaches from surgery to hardware design, upper limb, lower limb. But what makes that place special, and I think Ability Lab in general, is how well they do the clinical interaction and coupled with engineering. And it's something that we, now here in an engineering department, I don't have that as much. And I see that a lot more clearly on this side than I did on that side. But I would say it was a fantastic place to be trained. I wish every rehabilitation engineering PhD student could go through, spend some time at a rehabilitation hospital and listening to clinicians and listening to patients. And I would say that was kind of the formative part. Like that had the biggest impact on me. My advisor and mentor, Todd Kuiken, was really into the results and not being distracted by engineering. He was an MD PhD, so he was both a clinician and an engineer. So he kind of put that idea in my head and heart that like our job is not to just enjoy ourselves with fun engineering, but that we have some responsibility to be using that engineering in a way that benefits people's lives or impacts patients. And I think if I could say like one thing that Ability Lab provided that has really stuck with me and been a big part of my life is that concept. And I wish all my students could go through there. We tried to do a similar approach. They shadow in the PM&R department here at Michigan, but it's just a little bit different than them being down the hall. So uh, we do what we can, but it's certainly a very special place.
Yeah, I can relate. And I was at an institution, I think more similar to the University of Michigan, being very focused on the hardcore engineering, um, and found similar mentors that you described, like Todd Kuiken, but I had to find them in unexpected places, at conferences and in hospitals that I just hazarded into, rather than coming to that realization in a structured way, um, which is fine. That suits my personality. But a bit more structure in how engineers are trained in how and why people use wearable systems, assistive devices, would probably be a good thing for the world.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, and so also, yeah, then I've kind of been on the other side, which would be like the Google X side slash the Ray Institute, Robotics and AI Institute, which was more research driven, moonshot driven, not necessarily driven by fundamental science or federal grants, and that side's very different. And I kind of have enjoyed seeing a little bit of that, the differences from places like the X to RAI to IHMC are kind of ways they see research and do it differently. And it's probably more akin to the way it's done here at Michigan, probably the way it was done at CMU. But it's not as there's not as much focus on a clinician, the clinician side. There's multiple stakeholders involved in problem decision making and in solutions. So it's kind of a different world. But I've seen kind of both sides of that, and it's interesting. I try to have my students see both sides as well.
Yeah, could you elaborate a little bit on some of those corporate academic bridges you have built? Because I think that's another really unique thing about your background. It's not always easy to venture outside of the ivory tower and then come back in.
Tough. So yeah, I've had some awesome experiences. It's been really, really fun. I would attribute most of that to being in the right place at the right time. At least that was kind of like what it was with X. They just happened to be forming a exoskeleton team kind of when I met them. And what's funny is the thing that I think kind of linked me to them sort of more long term is I met Catherine Zealand, was the head of that team, is the head of that team, now the head of startup Skip. I met her at a conference, a number of years ago, And I didn't know who she was, and she just said she was interested in commercializing exoskeletons. And I said, like, "Run, like, don't do that." I said, "It's a terrible idea." And then we kept talking, I think that kinda piqued her interest, and we kept talking about, if we were gonna do it, what would it look like? Or like, how would we begin to think about exoskeletons as a consumer product as opposed to a medical device or a research device? And that was incredibly fun. A very different place. I was at, part of it when it was within X. It is now spun out and is a startup called Skip. They have a partnership with Arc'teryx and are releasing a product called Mogo next year. So it's a powered pair of pants. It has a powered knee joint built into the pants themselves. It is excellent. I'm very excited for it. But my job there was essentially form the team, help the team form. So I was a kind of co-lead with Catherine, and we got this team together, and I helped kind of articulate a vision of like longer term, what's a reasonable size and shape of something to pursue kind of at this time, which was at that time 2020-ish. And it was super fun. I got to hire some of my former PhD students, and they contributed immensely. But it was a very different pace, very different world than the academic side. I was glad to come back. Like I really I enjoy being a PI, principal investigator in the laboratory, and having kind of the ability to explore and have research independence. So I really enjoy what we do here, but I also really enjoyed working with X, and it was very very different. We were building a product in the sense that we were sketching a product out and figuring out what makes an exoskeleton good. Some of that came back into my research program, and we did some research papers kind of in that direction. But it was really fun and different. Then there's places like RAI, which is newer. They're kind of in this gray space between academia and industry. And it was an outstanding place to be. I really enjoyed it. It was so different. I was working on a bicycle that can jump and do acrobatics, so it was so not what I work on in the lab. And that was on sabbatical there. So that was the whole idea, was to kind of get knee deep in something really different. And I have a potentially new research direction that we were pursuing, uh, both in my lab, but also together at the IHMC, that kind of stemmed from the things I began learning in that sabbatical. But so Google X is definitely also in this gray space, kind of between academia and industry, but their objective is more, I would say, make headlines than it is like actually scientific progress or technical progress. Whereas the Ray Institute, I think, is more about real technical progress and less about headlines. Although headlines are still always part of it.
Fascinating. I love how the story began with like brutal honesty about the translatability of the market and all that. Um, I feel like the best innovations come from that place of optimism but brutal honesty at the same time.
Totally.
Um, and we need, moonshot funders like X, to be bold and audacious.
Yeah.
That's really
Yeah,
cool.
they serve a good role. I'm not sure it's the role like that it's not a good fit for me, I think. Like I want to see the needle move. I want to work on a project or work in an area and see that area get better. And I think at least the moonshot idea is, the projects are so big and they're so far off that you really never can tell if the needle's moving. And that's not for me.
Yeah. Many of the challenges we're all working on in this industry are grand challenges. They take decades of unsexy work before they produce, results that dazzle everybody.
Totally.
Yeah, we can all relate to that, and I can relate to living in the gray too. I mean, Humotech is a small organization, but definitely at that crossroads between academia and commercialization, and we're every day working to build those bridges.
Yep.
So I think by living in the gray, or those of us that do, we we have a little bit of a superpower, which is like being able to speak both languages and understand both worlds, and hopefully we can use that to improve people's lives. I think we do.
Definitely. I think that's right. I think Humotech is a great example. And I personally would say companies that are in this gray area are probably that's like what I would personally gravitate to. I think that's a really, like, that's where really exciting things can happen. On the purely PI side, then it's, we are continually working with small groups of trainees. We have our own kind of like setup that, we have to teach that takes a lot of time. It's harder to really build a big research program, I think, in academia.
Mhm.
It's a lot not as easy.
Well, this is a perfect segue to talking about the open source leg. And maybe first, why open source? So, like, what got you thinking about a gap in the marketplace that an open source approach could potentially fill?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's the project for the idea of the open source leg. So it's an ecosystem of hardware and software tools that facilitate the study of robotic leg control systems. So it's robotic leg hardware in the technical infrastructure that makes those systems work. What got that project going was originally controls researchers from the field at a conference in like 2016 or something. Of someone stood up, actually Bobby Gregg, raised his hand, stood up, and was like, "Can someone make a hardware system that we can use as controls researchers so that we don't have to build our own hardware system every time?" And I thought everyone agreed, like, yes, that's something somebody needs to do this. And so I thought, okay, I actually really like that idea, and proposed it and ran with it. Um, what I'd say, like the open source side, really came from the status quo in the field of everyone building their own hardware. So the quickest, like the most straightforward answer to that was, oh, we'll just make the hardware for them, so they can, instead of having to spend the time designing it, you can just have it built. But then, as we did that and rolled that out, we realized there's a lot of people who really would rather just buy it. And so that's where that's where Humotech comes in. But I think originally the idea was, I didn't necessarily think that there was a market for that. I didn't know researchers would want to pay, like to have that hardware. So sort of news to me when people were wanting to do that. So so that was kind of, it was kind of like an accident, I guess. But that's why open source, it seemed like the easiest way to get it out there. And there was in the back of my mind, there's always this, okay, well, if you open source it, there's no way for really it to become a product or be commercialized and protected and, translate into one of these companies making them for individuals, for consumer use. So I always knew, kind of, that was in the back of my mind, that if we open source it, we're kind of taking that off the table. But it seemed to me that the impact of having researchers have access to it was potentially more valuable or more impactful for the field than building a robotic leg that gets turned into a product.
Right. I mean, everything you're saying, mirrors the origin story of Humotech, except, of course, the kind of way in which IP is handled. And it's really cool how we've been able to meet sort of halfway and offer this hybrid solution, which, I mean, often happens in open source communities, actually.
Totally. Yeah,
Um,
that's right. That's right on. Yeah. That was also one of the things that helped us feel good about it, was that in the best cases, you do see open source products that have kind of their other tiered options. So like we kind of were thinking about that as well. But otherwise, every decision we make in that project has to do with making it easy to operate at scale and making it convenient for people. And that's also an interesting kind of way to design something. So the kind of intellectual side of that was captivating. How can you make a system that's lightweight, high performance, but yet also convenient and easy to use, and incredibly simple? And we just kind of take it one step at a time, and now we're many years in, and it's a pretty big ecosystem.
Yeah, everything you're talking about there is really important and hard. Uh, uh, a system which is very usable, very open, very customizable, um, has pretty different requirements than a leg which might be commercialized and sold as a prosthesis.
Totally. Yeah, and, like, those requirements make it fun on the design side, like,
Yeah,
that's the type of challenge that's interesting and captivating, so we have enjoyed the whole part, even the software side and building software libraries that are scalable and extensible and easy for people to interact with and kinda plug in and get going. That's been its own challenge and sort of source of reward, so we've
yeah.
enjoyed it too.
So, how have you, up until now, measured impact of the open source leg?
That is a great question. We track a lot of metrics on the open source leg project. So it would look like, number of times certain libraries are downloaded, or one of our tools is a continuous integration tool to connect to Wi-Fi and remote access into the leg. So every time that that's used, it has to be forked. So we track the forks of that part of the open source leg project. If you actually go on the website, we track all of the contributions through GitHub. So it shows kind of everyone that's contributed and their kind of relative like contributions and PRs and bug tickets and the things that they've done. And then we also are tracking publications and citations and all the kind of standard academic metrics, the forum, the number of users, the number of comments and responses. So we kind of heavily track it, but it's really difficult. Similar question would be, how do we know if we're doing good?
Yeah.
Like, could we be doing better? Like, it's hard to know that stuff. And so we keep our heads down and work hard and we try not to worry about it. And I guess like that's maybe the answer.
Yeah.
We don't really spend a ton of time, like, on this part of it. We capture everything, we're tracking it, but we don't know what is good yet, it's so new. We look at OpenSim a lot
Mm,
as an example of a really powerful, like, very successful open source project. So, we use them as our essentially as our guiding light.
mm. Oh, that makes sense. What's maybe an aspect of the impact that you're most proud of?
Well, that's a great question. I would say, I'm most proud of when I get an email from someone and it's maybe undergrad student or, a student from Malaysia or something, and they have done something. Hey, I downloaded this, I made these modifications, it's part of my undergrad, senior project or so, like sometimes I get these emails and they describe what someone has done and that's so amazing to me that the project, we have a project we've created over, 10 years or so, and then we get, an article or a picture or a thank you from someone across the world who's trying to help, and that keeps you coming back.
That's great. I feel similarly about our work. The OSL has been particularly successful for us overseas, which is important. I think, as a provider of platforms, to see the platform expanding across the world is really exciting because that means we're connecting different communities of developers, and I believe that will result in more innovation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it might be more exciting that there's been sort of maybe a greater interest overseas. That's incredibly cool. And I believe that a common hardware platform will make, comparison and research of these strategies faster, more convenient, more economical. So I sort of really see it as a benefit to the patients who eventually, like, it's our job to get these solutions out of the lab. And so I see this as a way for us all to kind of pull together.
Hmm. I recently ran into someone who wants to build an open source leg and send it home on a 2 week take home trial. How close are we to that being possible?
That is a great question. I mean, right now, I would say it would make me nervous to do that.
Yeah.
I don't know. We've never had, these systems go home away from, a laboratory and engineers, but I think that is coming. We're writing the next grant for the open source leg project right now. Will be an NIH grant, and in that grant, it is possible that we try to do a V3 redesign, which would enable things like take home studies. So it would be just making it a little more compact and streamlined.
Cool. Well, we should stay in touch on this point because I think, our primary founding principle was emulator systems, which are tethered and thus have very high performance and versatility. But the big selling point of a untethered system is the potential that you could take it home.
That's
Uh,
right.
so we'd be very excited to support that.
I think the field is kind of getting to the place where that's coming up next. And like it was a long time where we were not even close to that. It wasn't, even if we had systems we could take home, we weren't ready to do that as a field.
Exactly. Yeah.
Now we're pretty much there, and that's very exciting. That's a really cool way to look at it.
Yeah. And I think from my perspective, I mean, it is partly a technological problem, but actually, and I feel like, I mean, this may be controversial, but I feel like most of us as researchers are not trained in the style of research that happens in the home or out in the real world. It requires a fundamentally different approach to research.
100%. I think that's right on. But I kind of also think that the research enabled by those types of studies will be the kind of research we actually need to start learning some of the answers that are difficult, like what's good. A technology is good if it gets someone out into the community more, and it's a lot easier to measure that in the real world than it would be kind of in the lab. So I think that's kind of the next big step. It would be those types of studies, and I think it gives us access to the success of these technologies in a way that we've never had access before.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, ultimately, if you think of the translation problem, at the end of that, you have insurance companies and policymakers that care almost solely on the real world experience. So, okay, great. You've done some research that suggests with this control strategy, we can improve balance. But what does that mean in terms of dollars associated with falls? There's like quite a gap there in what the current literature tells us about real world impact of some of the things we measure in the lab.
Yes, I think that's right on. I think these take-home studies are coming up next. I know Levi Hargrove at Shirley Ryan AbilityLab has tried or started to do some take-home studies with some of their technology, but it is, I think, the next big question is, how now that we have tech and control strategies that might be robust enough to go home, how do we think about success then? And that's going to be, I think, a big change and very, very exciting.
Hmm, cool. I will stay tuned on that. Um, what are maybe some of the challenges with the open source approaches? What could we be doing better together?
Oh, challenges would be like support. As it turns out, even if you document and you kind of do all the things you like think are going to make it easy, it's still hard for people. It's still difficult.
Hmm.
So the biggest thing we're learning is like how to handle support requests and answer on the forum. Like right now we've seen in the forum side of the OSL website, people are answering each other's questions now, which is like, that's a huge help. So now the community is kind of engaging a little bit more uh, on its own. So that's been really great. But support is it's a much larger challenge than I was expecting. I was sort of thinking if we set it up right and we do it, make it convenient, and what we think is a relatively straightforward path that people would be able to follow it, and they wouldn't end up in sort of weird edge cases, but people do. That happens. There's no way around it. So that's been kind of interesting for us, is to just learn how to build technology that can be used at scale with limited support.
Huh. Yeah, I can echo that. And this is just fundamentally hard. Even massive corporations with tons of resources struggle with the cost of support. I mean, think about the last time you needed support for like your, I don't know, your Wi-Fi router at home.
Yeah.
Like it is so hard to get in touch with the company that manufactured that and get some help. We live in a society where it's just easier to throw that away and start with something new.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So that's been, like, probably the the hardest part, but one of the good sides, I'd say, is it's like, the federal government responds to funding. So the federal government is, like, supported us a lot from, mostly the National Science Foundation, and they back the open source side of it strongly. And they even created a new funding mechanism that only supports the development of open source ecosystems, and that's been funding us for the last 3 years. So, so that kind of support has been really valuable, which is linked to the open source side of it.
Yeah, that's I'm glad you mentioned that because it's a really unique funding mechanism. Obviously you've had a good experience. Do you think it's here to stay? Is it going to grow?
I think it's been incredibly successful. So this is NSF's Pathways to Open Source Ecosystems, or POSE funding. There's a phase one and a phase two. So we've had both of those. It's a lot of money and it's very fast. So it's been incredibly helpful for us to kind of get the project to the place that it's in now. But it was quick, so like, right now we're seeking additional support. We're almost done with the pose, but I do think it'll stick around. I think it was incredibly successful. I think some really powerful tools are going to come out of that program. Hopefully, yes, we're one of those. But that's from the new directorate at the NSF, the technology directorate. So that's been, I think, a really good thing over there.
It's a really interesting time for federal funding.
It
Lots of
is.
challenges, but also lots of opportunities.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
So we're zoomed in on the open source leg, and that's pretty much all you and I talk about. But you also work with exoskeletons and other kinds of systems. What is sort of the scope of your research at large?
Oh, that's a great question. And how much time do we have? I'm just kidding. We have lots of different types of projects going on, and I'll give you like a quick overview of the different areas. That kind of maybe like area we're talking about now is hardware design. So we
Hmm.
do like a decent amount of hardware design. The open source leg is in that area, but we also build wearable. We also build variable stiffness mechanisms. So these are prosthetic feet or exoskeletons that are torsion springs around your joints, but we can change the properties of those torsion springs from step to step. And we can do a lot of interesting things there. So recycle energy in the gait cycle, change, lift people's toes up during swing phase, which is a common place people stub their toes. So we can do some interesting aspects with the design of some of these machines. So we have the open source leg, and then we have variable stiffness prosthesis and variable stiffness orthosis. And then we have some interesting brushless motor hardware experiments. We were exploring the hardware design of exoskeletons where we would take the actuator mass and wrap it around the limb instead of putting it on the lateral side of the leg. So we have an actuator that runs, spins around the leg. You put your leg through it like a sock. Um, and then that turned out to be huge. In fact, this is the motor for it. That turned out to be gigantic.
Yeah.
So so we built it, and it's actually under review right now, but in order to make it smaller, we developed a version of that motor that goes around the limb, but the motor itself can open and close. So it's like a motor that's a bracelet, and
Wow.
it can open, close, and then can still act as a motor. So it's a kind of a hardware exploration. So that's coming out. That'll be submitted soon. So we have a section of the lab that builds hardware, and there's other projects in there that we're not talking about. Then we have a section of a lab that studies kind of how and why to use these technologies. So we study user preference. We look at people's preferred mechanical properties. We have a kind of a set of studies in that area. Um, we also study the mechanical impedance of the body. So we apply perturbations to the legs. We measure the mechanical response, and we use that to form our instructions, how to replicate or replace the mechanics of the body. So we are also looking at that for people post-stroke. So when you've had a stroke, it changes the coordination and mechanics of your joints, and oftentimes that's done measured in the clinic, kind of manually by a clinician interacting with your joint while you're seated. And so that information doesn't translate super well to gait impairment, which is dynamic instead of seated and, could be quantified rather than used as a kind of an index. So as what we do is perturb and then quantify these values rather than use the manual measurements in the clinic. And we're looking at kind of, does that help us inform treatment of these individuals? So we have a kind of a collection of studies on measuring the mechanical impedance of the body.
Do you have is there a medical school at the University of Michigan? Like, you have clinicians on site?
We do, yeah. For all of our, I mean, we have them come from the medical campus to our lab, and yeah. So the Michigan has a solid medical school with a PM&R department. So the clinicians are always like here for the fitting of the tech whenever there's a study going on.
Hmm. Neat. So
Yeah.
you've been very, I mean, I know you as like a ankle ankle and knee mechanics guy. Are you tempted or exploring any other parts of the body?
So far, we haven't actually. Like it's all been ankles and knees. Um, I am interested in pursuing the hip. We have a collaboration right now, actually, where we're doing a powered hip prosthesis for hip dysarticulation
Wow.
patients.
Yeah.
So that should be interesting, but that's a collaboration from a group in Belgium. But no, we haven't really. I mean, there aren't otherwise. We haven't really gone into the direction of the hip, mostly because it's just crowded. There's a lot of research already going on in that space. So
Yeah.
that's that's the main reason. It's just practical.
Hip exoskeleton, they're blowing up right now. Yeah, it just strikes me as I was listening to you give that overview that a lot of the technologies and approaches you're working could be translatable to other areas.
Yeah, totally. And then maybe the last area we have of our research group is kind of measuring the value of these technologies using behavioral economics or the Vic reaction process. And I'm pretty excited about that project and that area of research. Do you know that project?
Can you say more? I mean, it sounds very interesting.
This is essentially like when we were developing exoskeletons and wanting to know whether they were successful and they weren't serving a clinical purpose.
Mhm.
How do we know if they're successful? When it's clinical, there's a clear metric and you're addressing a deficit. When it's augmentative and it's working on a healthy person, what is the way to measure value? Traditionally, our field has pretty much only done metabolic rate. So this was like, is there a way to look at it differently? In the past, we had measured people's ability to discriminate changes in their own metabolic rate, and people were very bad at it.
Yes.
So, so people really had no idea if their metabolic rate was changing. So we wanted to figure out, is there a different way we can quantify the success of an exoskeleton without using metabolic rate? So the way we did this was, imagine you're walking uphill on a treadmill, 10 degrees at 1.5 meters per second. So like no fun, hard, difficult task. And so imagine I ask you, how much money do I have to pay you to do that task for 2 minutes? And then at the end of that 2 minutes, I ask you again, how much money do I have to pay you to do another 2 minutes? And then another 2 minutes, and then another 2 minutes. And so we end up with is a sort of a relationship between time walked and the kind of cost to do that walking. And then now imagine you're doing that task of uphill walking, and I give you an exoskeleton, and it's meaningfully assisting you. It's really helping you. Now I ask you, how much money do I have to pay you for 2 minutes of uphill walking? And then again and again. And you would think that if the exoskeleton is actually providing a benefit to that person, that would be reflected in a lowering of the amount of money they need to be paid to do the task. So that's the general idea. And then in order to get honest evaluations of the cost, so we need people to be honest about the value of their time. they can't just try to make as much money as possible. They have to be honest about it. And so the way that we did that was by using something called a Vickrey auction, which is a tool from behavioral economics that's used to get the abstract value of, or get a value of abstract concepts. So like it's a tool kind of in behavioral economics. Now every 2 minutes it's an auction. So it's a sequential series of auctions.
Fascinating. Is it too early to speak about results?
Oh, no, I can tell you the results. They're also fascinating. So we use Defy's exoskeleton of 2018. So their old controller. So we're not evaluating our own controller. We're evaluating a controller from what I would say is it's a leading group. And we measured the value of the exoskeleton. So the value of the assistance. We measured the value of assistance alone, and we measured the cost of wearing the added weight. So we measured those three costs, or those three values. The value to wear the exoskeleton, the value returned to the subject was low. It was only like about $3 an hour. So, kind of deflating. But when we looked at how much cost it would take to wear the added weight, so we compared exoskeleton powered off to not wearing an exoskeleton, we can
Right,
get value of the weight. That was hugely costly.
right.
So about minus $19 an hour or something. So it was a huge cost. And then when we looked at just the value of the assistance, it essentially negates that minus kind of 19 to plus kind of $3 or $4. So the value of the assistance was really large, maybe $23 an hour, but its value is almost entirely consumed by the cost of wearing the added weight. Isn't that that's so interesting?
Yeah, yeah, and cost, actually mean financial cost, not metabolic cost. You may come to different conclusions, but um, what this gets me thinking about is, can you build a bridge here logically to the economics of purchasing an exoskeleton? It's like an inversion of what you're talking about.
But that's a great question. And that's something that we're also thinking about. Like if something has this much value, if we can sort of assess and measure its value, how does that relate to the value that a person would pay for it? And this goes back to this idea of like a test drive. How do people get that experience and make that decision? And like if we were thinking, what we wanted was a metric that was sort of equivalent to a test drive, where someone could use the system and receive some serious information back about how well it did. And metabolic rate, for example, can't do that. It can't be that test drive because people can't perceive it.
Yeah,
So
and people don't. Well, as rational economic buyers, we have to somehow weigh all sorts of metrics in a way which, I mean, is not purely rational. Like,
totally. Yeah,
um,
there's also all those factors.
yeah, yeah, that is the challenge I have with behavioral economics sometimes. But it's really cool that you're attacking this problem in a way I hadn't heard of before.
Yeah, that's been really interesting. We've been continuing that project. So that was published a year or two ago, and we're kind of continuing that work. We're using it. So one thing we have is a variable stiffness prosthesis.
Right.
So this is, very different than the status quo of a single shaped piece of carbon fiber. This is a sort of small mechanism that can change its stiffness from step to step. And that technology, how valuable is that? How valuable is it that it can change stiffness for things like incline? And like right now, one of the ways we're going to answer that is by running that same study. And so we'll be able to say, a prosthesis that can change its stiffness or can allow for incline walking more easily, it has this much value to that person. And then maybe, so right now I'm having a hard time getting, now that we've developed prosthesis tech and exoskeleton or orthosis tech that's what I would say is viable, could be a product. We haven't seen the companies that manufacture these systems like kind of take it on. They sort of don't seem inclined, trying to figure out like why that is. Why
That's a
is it?
whole nother topic, which is also fascinating.
I'm sure. My mind is blown. I sort of felt like if I do my part, like that should be enough to, get the tech to the people who need it. And now what I'm realizing is it's a lot more complicated than that. It's not just that, that tech doesn't exist.
Yeah, to stick with the behavioral economics frame of mind, you're now entering into a world where there's multiple economic decision makers, not
Yes,
just the end user. It's like this
right.
multitude of people that need to buy in,
That's right.
um, and why they buy is often opaque.
Yes. So, like, I think that's right on. So that here's my current plan is to do this study that looks at the sort of value of the experience. And if that value is high, to make a big deal about it, to try to get the attention of these companies and maybe of the patients. But at this time, there's no, even though we've developed it, the tech, and it's, what I would say is, pretty close to ready, that's not, that's not enough.
Have you considered like decoupling the technical aspects from the behavioral economics aspects? So, like, you could do this study with clinically available products, stuff that's already on the market. I mean, there's already a massive variety of functionality and price points out in the market.
Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting point. So we are doing this study now with the variable stiffness prosthesis and getting its value in this way. And the comparisons, there's three feet we're studying. Ours, so the variable stiffness one, the subject's take home, and then everyone gets a specific Oser foot. So one of those values will be from a commercial product, and we'll be able to at least compare, ours versus a commercial product, and then compared to their take home. So I think that'll be interesting. It kind of it's a step in the direction of what you're saying, but that's a good idea would be to anchor some of the value in known products that people already have an understanding of, what that value is, even if it's not framed in economics. So it
Yeah,
would I think that's a really good idea. We haven't done that.
fascinating. Um, all right. Well, we're coming up on the hour. Time flew. Holy cow! Wanted to see if we could wrap this up with a call to action for our audience is often innovators, sometimes early in their careers, sometimes later. But you're like deeply involved. I see you as one of the leaders that's kind of defining how people get started in this industry as engineers. So I was wondering if you could give us some pearls of wisdom on how people early in their career could define their direction. They can't all go work for in your lab. So what should they be looking for in the beginning of their research graduate school journey?
That's a great question. That's a big question. I would say, I guess this is my go-to answer when this is not necessarily a specific answer to your question, which I can probably get to, but it's kind of the thing that I tell students when they're coming in and talking to me and they're kind of asking, how do I get started, or what's my next step? The thing that I kind of have people focus on here is being able to convert your effort into results, which sounds easy. It sounds like everyone can do it, but it's actually, I think, a skill that maybe 1 in 8 people can do.
Hmm.
And it means like when someone is working on something, at the end of that time, something can be shown, something it turned into something. And it's very easy, especially in academics where training is a big part of it. So easy to sort of let that slide and just we're learning. We're learning. Or, so like what I try to tell people is no, what everyone's paying attention to is can you move the needle? And people seem to respond to that. And I would say that's the thing that I have focused on. I haven't necessarily like thought every step out like many years in advance. Like I have not done that. What I have done is keep my head down, move the needle, and take a next step. And so that's what I would sort of prompt people. Like I would advocate for that.
I love it. I need to hear that. Thank you, Elliot.
In terms of getting started, it's getting started in academics is tough. It is a challenging. There's a lot of different directions that you're being pulled in. In kind of our world, I would say a really important thing is, obviously having a vision of where your research is going and the contributions you want to make in that future, but also having access to the practical things. It's easy to overlook that side, but having access to good hardware, having access to good colleagues and students. And so those things, I guess maybe that's not, I don't know, that's obvious maybe, but have one thing we've had access to that's been incredibly helpful is good hardware.
Reach.
Free.
Thanks, Elliot.
Thanks so much for having me. This was really fun. Josh, I can't wait to see it when you guys post it or kind of do your thing. This is really, really great that you do
Of
this.
course, we'll get busy. All right. Thank you, everyone. That's Elliot Rouse.